Hi, this is Identity Crisis, and I'm Yehuda Kurtzer. We're coming in on the anniversary of October 7th, which is now on the English calendar, and will be on the Hebrew calendar at the end of the Jewish holidays on Simchat Torah. I'm worried about this anniversary, and I know I'm not alone. I know a lot of rabbis who are anxious about how the Jewish holidays are going to look and feel this year, aware that many of us remember and are processing these events very differently. And when personal memories get subordinated to a collective official memorial event, it can sometimes feel alienating and wrong. There's nothing worse than getting memory wrong. We have malicious actors in the world who try to get memory wrong, folks who falsify history, who seed doubt about historical events, and who draw inflammatory causal lines between the events of the past and their ramifications in the present. Take the case of Holocaust deniers, for instance. That kind of getting it wrong induced a secondary trauma for the Jewish people after the Holocaust, because they not only had to survive the trauma of the Shoah, but had to fight for it to be remembered right, with all of the indignity that connotes. More recently, efforts to call into question the Hamas atrocities of October 7th create the same effect. That feeling I've quoted before from Professor Jill Stouffer of ethical loneliness, the experience of being both victimized and then not believed. And unfortunately, Jews are not always the victims of this kind of malicious questioning of the memories of others. I do not understand, and I'm ashamed by when some Jews insist that the Palestinian experience of Nakba, not the story of what happened in 1948 from an objective historical sense, but the Palestinian experience of Nakba, their trauma, the experiences in their formative memories, are somehow false or a lie. You can absolutely be a Zionist who grants Palestinians the legitimacy of their trauma and their essential memories. The insistence otherwise is a dangerous human instinct that has been bad for the Jewish people, and we shouldn't do it. It's an instinct that misunderstands memory entirely. But there's a less malicious way of getting memory wrong, which lies in questions of timing and ritual, and the politics of how we choose to remember something and why. Memory is not history. I argued in my book Shuvah that history informs while memory obligates. Memory is the technology that we use, sometimes consciously and sometimes unconsciously, to assimilate the past into our present and our future, the way that we derive meaning selectively from events in our past, which shape how we act and which shape our values. That means that even without the malice of others who try to undermine the legitimacy of our story or anyone's story, we are ourselves constantly working out what our story really means. We ourselves are shaping the story of our past in relationship to our present. We're forming the version of our past that our descendants are going to tell one day. And here, too, I think there's a real risk that we're going to get it wrong. When I wrote about Holocaust memory in Shuvah, I was particularly anxious that, in part because of those malicious actors that I mentioned above, we had not done enough as the Jewish people to assimilate the Holocaust into memory. We had invested a lot of our resources, rather, into preserving the history. An example of this, which we're starting to remedy now, my colleagues at the Ritual Center at Hartman in Israel, was that there was widespread lack of meaningful Jewish liturgy and ritual about the Holocaust. We heard a lot of testimonials from survivors on Holocaust Remembrance Day, but we didn't narrate all that much of it ourselves. It would be like having Passover Seders, where all we did was listen passively to the recorded testimonial of an Israelite maidservant from that fateful evening leaving Egypt. Memory is supposed to transform an event that happened to our ancestors to something that happened or is happening to us. It's its own serious project that requires its own methodology, and historians don't have the tools. What's more, you can see the lack of coherent, fully formed memory about the Shoah in so much contemporary Jewish infighting that is rooted in our continued trauma response. Without saying it out loud, nobody acknowledges it. We are collectively competing for the right moral message to take from the Shoah, the right set of obligations that it is supposed to invite in us, and that process is really unruly. But what are we supposed to do about an event like October 7th, which didn't take place 3,000 years ago, or even 2 generations ago, but just a year ago? And what about the fact that we're not yet at a place where there was an event and an aftermath? It's more like we are still, in some ways, inhabiting the original event. If memory creates obligation, if memory forms identity, then it's a really powerful tool. And amidst the dangerous choices that Israel faces today and that the Jewish people face more generally, it feels like there's a lot of risk right now in the work of making memory and making meaning. My colleagues at Hartman in Israel have been working on this too at our Ritual Center. They produced a ritual that involves narrating the events of October 7th and their consequences with a series of candle lightings that carry through the Jewish holiday season until its very last day, which is also the day on the Jewish calendar, which marks the 1-year anniversary of the attacks. It's a really sensitive effort. It's been rendered beautifully into English. I think they did a great job, even though there's a small part of me that wonders whether it is too soon. The rabbis famously transformed Hanukkah through narrative, through religious obligations, to become something very different than the military holiday that they inherited. But how many centuries did it take? On the other hand, if we don't start creating ritual structures out of the past, even now, someone else will, and their choices, the memory they create, the obligations they invite, those might be far worse. Contest for the past begins immediately. Meanwhile, even without any concerted efforts, October 7th is going to flow throughout the religious rituals of these 3 weeks of the Jewish calendar, especially for families in Israel marking the first year without their relatives who were killed in this past 11 months, or who have family members still at war, or who are still suffering through all of the trauma induced on that awful day. Memory making will happen whether we try to engineer it or whether it simply emerges on its own. But I think most of all, I believe in stories. Stories about the past, whether we remember the details correctly of the event in question or we don't. Those stories appeal to something in our brains and in our souls that begins the process of translating event to meaning, all of it intertwined with emotional response. So I'm not sure I can remember the eulogies told at my beloved grandfather's funeral, but I do remember a great story that took place on the drive to the funeral. That story always makes me laugh, and I think that connection, interlaced with that experience from every time I tell the story, comes closer to how I want to remember my grandfather than those canonical speeches given by his graveside. The stories that we tell are ultimately the bricks that build the castle in our consciousness that is memory, a structure that will stand the test of time. Last year, at a loss as the events of October 7th transpired, with so much analysis and commentary all around us, we here at Identity Crisis just sought out, listened for, and then curated some stories for you. You may remember that episode. We certainly haven't forgotten it. It started with a voice note on WhatsApp from my friend Elizabeth Maiman in Zichron Yaakov, who immigrated to Israel about 20 years ago. With Elizabeth telling me the story of her first 48 hours after the attack.
This feels to me, sitting here, like some version of a 9/11. Beautiful blue sky here on Saturday. Beautiful blue sky, the same 9/11 blue sky.
So I then, at the time, asked 6 other friends and colleagues, all also American Jewish immigrants to Israel, to share their stories as well. And our team wove them together into a beautiful time capsule. For our 1-year episode today, we went back again to those folks to ask all of them, what's changed since then?
This is Elizabeth. Sorry, I'm trying to gather my thoughts together.
What have you learned? What does it feel like to reflect on this impossible year?
When I spoke and left that message last year, I left a message to my good friend who I leave random long messages to, reflecting on my life, not unlike I do other times. And so here I am. I want to express how I feel, but I know I have an audience that isn't just Yehuda or Yehuda and Stephanie.
We heard from Todd Berman.
I want to thank the Shalom Hartman Institute for this invitation to reflect over the course of the year.
Diana Ginsburg.
I'm grateful for this opportunity to begin to put into words my own experiences and feelings.
Anna Bronstein.
The effects of everything that's going on me and my family and the people that we know.
Dina Rabhan.
So I'm going to be sending you a number of different voice notes.
And Avidan Friedman.
I'm going to send my messages to you probably not all at once.
It's not going to be one long stream of thought.
I'm just going to start.
If I would have known a year ago that I would be recording a year later and that we would be in the situation that we're in, would it have been better if someone would have said it's going to be brutal and devastating with incredible grief and loss and the timeline is as follows? Or is it better to not know what the timeline is because this is brutal as well?
I never would have imagined when I recorded that first note a few days after the war that he would be almost a year later with the same government, with hostages still in Gaza, with people still evacuated from their homes.
Hard to believe the year has passed.
War still going on in Gaza with soldiers there, with war going on in the north.
On the other hand, it feels like a lifetime has passed by.
Over the past year, there have been 3 funeral processions within a 3-minute radius of my house.
2 of my neighbor's sons were killed, one on October 7th and one in the fighting in Gaza.
Many of my friends and acquaintances and colleagues have, over the course of the year, been in and out of reserve duty.
Nobody is more than 1 degree separated from somebody who's lost or who has somebody fighting or who has a hostage family member.
Friends who spent months and months in reserve duty. The director of my yeshiva was drafted back in reserve duty just last night.
Thank God for my family, that was not the case.
I've heard a lot of people say recently that they did not expect the war to go on this long. I did. I think early on I understood that we're in this for a while.
And it's been hard to know throughout this year whether the events preceding the war, the widespread antipathy and protests against the government, the major social divisions within Israeli society, the larger context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which long preceded October 7th and tragically will outlive even this war in Gaza, whether any of those issues will be resolved by this war, or whether it will be a tragic piece of punctuation in an otherwise weirdly continuous story.
Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they stay the same.
And of course, October 7th was not a singular event. October 7th unleashed an intense war that began that day, now unfolding on 3 fronts: in the north, in the south, in the West Bank. 4 fronts if you count air attacks from Yemen and Israel's response. 5 if you count the domestic and international battles for Israel's legitimacy.
In the days immediately following October 7th, I had 2 questions that really preoccupied me, that over the course of this past year continued to preoccupy me. Are we going to be able to maintain our humanity in the course of this very awful and brutal war?
I've been to Israel 5 times since the war broke out. The fronts are in the south, the north, the west, distant, although not that distant as the crow flies, from the 2 major population centers of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. But the war is visibly everywhere, on people's faces and on the street.
I stop at a traffic light and in front of me and to the side of me, I see massive posters of the female soldiers who are still hostages after they were brutalized, where it says, what if these were your daughters?
Posters of kids who you know, the families you know who were killed.
What if this was your son? What if this was your father?
And you see posters everywhere you turn.
All over Israel, because our pain and our war have been entirely politicized, plastered across streets and walls. And there's one particular sign that just haunts me because it's the sign that says, we will not normalize this. And yet at the same time, what can we do? What does it mean to live a year into this horror with no end in sight without trying to make some semblance of normalcy?
Living a normal life while persisting through this, through not just having to remember the events of an awful day, but while still fighting what seems like an unending and merciless war. I think back to America after 9/11, what a deep trauma that was, and how it also bred 2 incredibly consequential wars. For many Americans with servicemen and women in their families, this stretched 9/11 out for decades. But for others of us, it was easy to separate the events. And it was easy to detach from those wars which were fought far away on foreign soil. Israel's geography, its small size, and its citizen army simply don't allow that to happen. There are a lot of Israelis who are leaving Israel who can't take it anymore But the majority that stay struggle through the daily toll of this proximity to war and all of its emotional consequences.
And the other question was on a very personal level. I have 2 kids. They're 6 and 9 years old. How are we going to be able to get through this? And how can I, as a parent, keep them safe? Not just physically safe throughout most of the war. Physically, thank God, we have been very safe. But emotionally, psychologically, we have not been okay.
I took my grandson. We went on a train ride to Tel Aviv to go to the mall to go buy Legos. And when we were waiting in the train station, there was a massive poster of the hostages. And he looked at me and he said, "Safti, what is that picture?" And of course, as a grandparent, I want to be really careful about what I say and make sure that it's aligned with how my daughter's been communicating to him about it. So I said, "Well, what did mommy tell you?" And he said, "Well, mommy told me that those are the people that are lost." And I said, "Yes, that's true." And then he said, "But why is there a baby and little kids on that poster? Are they lost also?" Definitely not a conversation that I ever thought I'd ever be having to have with any child, certainly not my 5-year-old grandson, and was able to, on the spot, come up with a message of, yes, the baby is lost, but the baby is lost with his mommy, so he's with his mommy.
How can we really heal from all of this?
I want you to brace yourself for this story from Elizabeth. It's hard to hear.
My kid, Adiv, went to therapy in the middle of this year because he was running away from home, running away from shul. We tried to protect him from this information, but he heard it somewhere from some other kid in Gun or something. He heard that bad guys were coming into homes and killing people's kids. How will my 5-year-old ever recover from that?
What's happening to us? What's it doing to us on the inside that we've learned to live with what we've learned to live with?
We will be new people because of what happened. And that 5-year-old will certainly be a new person because of that. This is what he said to our neighbor that was running after him. "I have to practice my ninja moves in the forest because bad guys are coming into homes and hurting children." That's a little too real, you know? That's our kids. And that doesn't count the people in Lebanon and some of the people in Gaza and their children who are, the first victims of Hamas that, we've made enemies.
The traumas hit at every age, but trauma responses are different. Israeli teenagers are also a kind of different breed than the ones we have here. Maybe because the army looms differently than college for them. Maybe because the culture of teen independence in Israel is much stronger than we have here.
My son, who was in 12th grade, now he started the Hesder program, which is pre-army yeshiva. His senior year didn't exist. Half his faculty were called up to reserve duty. Half the classes couldn't even happen because the teachers just weren't there. So many people lost kids. Every school I know has lists of the alumni who were killed.
Todd's comments resonate hard for our institution. Our community of scholars, staff, and faculty has lost a lot of people, including alumni, grandchildren of some of our founding staff. Most recently, one of the hostages who was killed, who was related to one of our staff and friends with many other. The hostages are a whole other layer to this, reflecting a plight in some ways disconnected from the war, a plight that has provided optimism at moments of hostage releases or escapes, immense sadness at most other times. Hostages represent a window into some of the powerlessness that feels still present to so many Israelis, even as Israel demonstrates more power throughout this war than its enemies hold.
The founder of one of our partner organizations that works with farmers in Ethiopia and Rwanda. She was taken hostage with 6 other members of her family. In the hostage deal Saturday night, Motzei Shabbat, I had gotten a message before Shabbat saying that her kids and grandkids were going to be freed. I had no knowledge that she was alive until Saturday night. I got a message from somebody saying that she was being released. If you will recall, that was the second night when there was a significant delay in getting them out. I'm not someone who normally says Tehillim, Psalms, but for those 6 hours, I said them nonstop. I, like many others, were very involved in supporting her organization during those initial weeks of her captivity when they were working nonstop to run their organization and to secure her release. And they had a big milestone of a new project that they were going to launch in Rwanda. And when we asked her number two, why do you keep doing this? Like, you can just focus on securing her release. You do not need to launch this new project in Rwanda. He said, if she comes back and hears that we did not launch the project on time, we will have hell to pay. And then he was among the first who saw her in the hospital upon release because he's been a close colleague of hers for years. And within 5 minutes of seeing her, she said, well, did you launch the project in Rwanda? I've now become very, very close with her and have sort of seen her fight on behalf of other hostages and other survivors and people from the Otef, from the Gaza envelope. Her son-in-law is still in captivity in Gaza. She came back to Israel to discover that her husband, sister, brother-in-law, and brother-in-law's caretaker were all murdered on October 7th. She did not know that the 50 days that she was in captivity.
I was walking to a friend's house for Suda Shlishit one Shabbat afternoon, and someone in the street said they found Noah.
That's Noah Argamani, one of the few hostages who was rescued alive.
I said, what? And they're like, they rescued some hostages. They were rescued. And I was like, are you serious? And then I walked by someone else who's looking at his cell phone as I'm like walking with a kid to meet a friend for his birthday celebration that he's having for the end of Shabbat for Suda Shlishit. And I saw this guy on the street. I'm like, hey, you with the cell phone, like, is this true? Like, can you confirm this for me? He's like, yeah. And then he tells us the names. And I get to the Suda Shlishit and, I'm like, happy birthday, Yonatan. He's like, whatever. He's like, here's the bottle of wine or whatever. He's like, there's only one birthday present I want. And I'm like, I might have that birthday present. I was walking down the street and I found this information out. We rescued these 3 hostages. And he's like, do you remember their names? And I'm like, I don't remember their names, but I remember that they saved Noah. He's like, they saved Noah? And my friend Vered went over to her kitchen, to her windowsill. And she took her little pieces of paper of all the names of all the hostages. I guess they have them on display, and she removed Noah's. And she's like, okay, we'll wait until after Shabbat and we'll find out who the other 2. And she got to remove them off of her list. I mean, that was a moment of great elation, because that's the wish that we want every single day, is that these hostages will come home.
I'm recording this as I am in front of the Knesset, and I have joined up with others on a hunger strike on November, 35 days after October 7th. I decided I couldn't deal with the fact that we had then 240 captives that we didn't even know what their fate was, and I decided to start a hunger strike in Kikar Chatufim in Hostage Square in Tel Aviv. I sat there for about a week straight, a solid week, where I was there in Kikar Chatufim, not moving. And there I really encountered face-to-face the glory of the Jewish people, a deep, deep sense of solidarity, of partnership in fate, of a feeling of just family, people from all over the country coming in order to support the families of the hostages.
Did I expect the hostages to still be in captivity? I don't think I thought about it that way. I really hope they would have been home 1,000 yesterdays ago. I mean, I think about them all the time, but I particularly think about them during Shabbat candlelighting. It's astounding to me that week after week after week, A
month ago, we woke up early in the morning on the first day of school. It was a terrible morning.
Elizabeth is now taking us back to that awful night. It was night here, morning in Israel, when the news of the killing of the 6 hostages broke.
Every morning since then, terrible morning, because every morning you wake up and what you wanted can't happen because you've been praying. You wanted a result that's not possible. It's no longer possible.
There's nobody steering this ship, or maybe there is somebody steering this ship, but is steering it the wrong way for all the wrong reasons. And everyone I know is filled with rage and stress.
I fear that the culture of demonstrations, regardless of the subject, are necessarily reductive, and that we are losing our ability to have painful, difficult, nuanced, compassionate conversations with people with whom we disagree.
I'm torn on this. I share Avidan's fury with the Israeli government, which I spoke about a few weeks ago in the podcast after Hirsch was killed. I feel like they have compromised away a lot of the trust that needs to be earned by leaders as they lead their people through treacherous terrain. At the same time, I confess, I fear some of the protests too. Maybe it's just dispositional. I don't know how to handle a lot of the anger. Here in America, I definitely wonder about bedfellows. Diana talked at length about how her work at Olam, an NGO organizing a network of Jewish and Israeli organizations, all specializing in humanitarian aid, international development, and global volunteering, and how that work has evolved over the course of this year. She spoke about the complexity of some of their Israeli organizational partners adding on to the work that they were already doing in developing countries around the world, and now taking on responsibility for local populations, evacuees, Bedouins in the Negev, Nova massacre survivors. She also spoke about the work that some such organizations were doing to facilitate humanitarian aid in Gaza, some privately, some publicly, and ultimately serving as bridge builders and coordinators and conveners and a go-between between the humanitarian sector in Gaza and the Israeli authorities.
A lot of that work has been done under the radar screen for a variety of reasons, including safety, security, and because some of those organizations are also working with impacted populations in Israel, it was very important to those organizations to share why they were going to go do work in Gaza with those populations to help maintain the trust with the populations themselves.
She reflected on all of that, but also on the strained relationships in this field that have emerged.
A certain partner of ours has been working on the response to the earthquake in Turkey that happened this past year. The partnership was between a Jewish organization and the Turkish government. And after October 7th, the Turkish government basically stopped answering their calls. At a certain point, this organization realized what was happening. And instead of leaving the community that they had been serving for several months, they found another partner, actually a local Muslim NGO, who was very happy to continue the partnership with this organization. A lot of our partners have continued to maintain these relationships, even in Muslim-dominant countries, but finding partners that are willing to work with Israeli and Jewish organizations.
A strange additional aspect of this war for many Israelis has been watching as their country and its fate are increasingly the objects of international scorn and the subject of what seems like a global referendum.
Just today, I learned of someone who came back from a conference in the U.S. She runs a program in Israel that delivers medical services to homeless populations in Tel Aviv. That is what she does. She went to present her work to an umbrella organization that does this work around the world, delivering services to people who are homeless. After she gave her presentation, which had nothing to do with the conflict, had nothing to do with the war, she said, and once again, this is now, this was not 11 months ago, basically other medical practitioners who serve homeless populations around the world wanted to boycott her presence at this conference.
Looking on social media and watching the vilification of Israel over and over again has been a very difficult experience. One thing that I did was I decided everywhere on social media where I could, I would just follow people who are supporters of Israel, who are Zionists, simply because I needed the feeling of community, that there are people out there who don't vilify us for trying to defend our homeland.
My friends that I made in business school, they're still my friends, but it's been hard. We're on a break from being in contact with each other all the time because it's too hard. We're hearing different media and different messages, and we need different things. That's very painful. It was my birthday. No one sent me a happy birthday message. Now, my birthday was on Sunday, and the war in the north just broke out, and that added additional level of stress, and, maybe.
A few moments of affirmation stand out. At Hartman this past summer, we sold out all of our programs for North Americans.
People who chose to come to Israel despite the war, and not just to come to Israel, but to study and to be in community and thinking about Israel tomorrow and what that means and how we can all contribute to it.
You could see on the faces of my Israeli colleagues the sense of gratitude and affirmation that they felt in the arrival of these guests, especially with so many other tourists having chosen to stay home.
Meeting those people and being part of those conversations, and felt like a hug of support from people from abroad.
I've gained a newfound appreciation for basic chesed, for acts of loving kindness, showing up and being present and giving someone a meal or a hug or a hand while they're suffering, and doing that again and again and again.
My son's had so many conversations. The expectation kind of was he would go to yeshiva and then eventually go to the army and whatnot. And they're questioning, should we be in yeshiva? Why aren't we fighting the army? What could we do more for the country? What more could we do for people?
Community and society has really come together, not in a unity sort of way, but to just help people, helping each other, people helping people in need.
Every day, you should see the WhatsApp groups.
War creates a home front. We covered this on the show very early on, and my friends found ways to help back then and still are doing so now in ways that stretched their time and their competencies.
A whole bunch of Anglo-Israelis are busy working in greenhouses that don't have workers in them anymore, and, picking eggplants and winding and harvesting cucumbers and packing bananas. Individual volunteerism has been beautiful and really spectacular. We are hosting hundreds and hundreds of refugees that are from the north or the south. We are preparing meals 3 times a week for soldiers that are getting moved to the north.
Children that grew up in my house, 19, 20-year-old children who were silly in my basement playing games and who are now being shipped into Gaza and now on the northern front, didn't have basic necessities. And so I have spent the past year doing what I can to take care of them, get them what they need. I get these incredible messages of thanks from these kids, WhatsApp messages thanking me and the patrons who are supporting the gear. And I always write back to them that I'm ashamed. They shouldn't be thanking me. They're the ones who are putting their lives on the line.
I keep going back to something Avidan said earlier in this show, that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Maybe another way of saying that is that abnormalities do not erase the normalities of living.
Despite it all, we attended weddings, we attended bar mitzvahs.
People go on and live their lives. People get engaged and married, and life is able to go on. I remember when I was on a hunger strike, day 35, 40, and somebody said to me, what if these people come home, what would even be of them? How much could they even function after that awful nightmare? And yet you see the people who came out of captivity, many of them are able to return to life. Not only to return to life, they're going and they are protesting for the sake of the hostages that were left behind. A week ago, I heard the incredible testimony of a woman who was there for 50 days, and she wants to return back to her home. She hopes to return to her home in kibbutz near Oz. The resilience of the human spirit, the way people are able to handle the most awful conditions with nobility is an incredibly inspiring thing.
I wouldn't call it resilience because I don't think that it falls under the category of resilience. I'm thinking more broadly about the human condition and how human beings can endure during such trying and difficult circumstances. We're living a life and trying to find joy and celebrating milestones and doing whatever we can because we have the luxury to be able to do that. But we sit in proximity to those who have husbands who are serving like their third time in Miluim and reserve duty. My neighbor next door, their uncle is the oldest hostage in Gaza. So we live with this insane dissonance all the time, trying to keep this country operating, to keep our families operating, to keep ourselves operating, while also understanding the profound devastation that we're living in. It's the persistence of this kind of reality, which is wearing everybody down. It's wearing all of us down.
I asked all of my friends what they've learned from this past year. And I know it wasn't really a fair question.
What have I learned over this past year? Right now I'm wearing a t-shirt that says "Hope is mandatory," which is a line that I heard from Rachel, mother of the captive who was killed, Hirsch Goldberg, Poland.
If she could have hope at like the darkest moments, that we all have to have hope, that it's part of our obligation. I don't know what she thinks now, but that has really stayed with me.
It's been a year of learning how hard it is to maintain hatikva, how to maintain the hope, and holding on to it as a mandate.
Of course, hope is essential in times like this. It also, for some, may feel like a distraction, a luxury, or even an impossibility. At minimum, the work of sustaining hope, trying to use it to leverage change, all of that requires hard work, as my colleague Rachel Jacoby Rosenfield wrote recently in a blog post on the idea of hope. For some of my colleagues in Israel, it's difficult right now to get past the brokenness in Israeli society and globally that stands in the way of moving past these current crises.
With all of our ability to do amazing things together, there are some real, significant, and very, very deep, fundamental ideological disagreements between different segments of the Israeli population that can't be papered over and that need to be understood, respected, and also given their proper proportions.
Maybe what's going on here of the past 70 years, the way that I grew up in America, a teenager in the 90s, whether it's Gaza or Lebanon or Ukraine or really like all over the world, maybe the default is that we just are all attacking each other and living under attack all the time. And that's horrible and depressing and really makes me realize my own privilege in the way I grew up and the way that I'm used to living and expect to live, and really how we all should be living, all of us around the world. It's actually insane that the way that humans think that they can solve their problems and get what they want is by trying to kill as many people as possible.
Everyone's like, it's not a sustainable solution. It's not a sustainable solution. And like the only thing that's sustainable seems to me like to brainwash everyone to peace.
And it's hard not to connect all of this remembering to the Jewish holiday season upon us, with all of its narratives of renewal and memory and the cycles of life.
Getting ready for Simchat Torah this year, everywhere you go, there are discussions about what are we going to do? Are we going to dance? Are we going to, maybe there should just be one year where you don't do it, but you're not supposed to not do those things on holidays. It's supposed to have joy. It's really complicated. Years ago, I heard someone, a Chabadnik, after some difficult events that happened, I guess, in Kfar Chabad, said that the Rebbeinu Shalom, the God, has a lot to answer for. I kind of feel like we're going into the times of Slichot, of penitential prayers, and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and I kind of feel like we're the ones who should be sitting in judgment on God, not God sitting in judgment on us. And I don't believe for a second that I think the whole tone and tenor of the days of repentance are going to be radically different. For me, there has to be some reckoning in the cosmic realm of my religious experience.
I think I've thought about it in terms of just how fragile things are. There have been mornings this year where I've woken up and the first thing I've thought is, wow, I'm still alive, especially around Iranian invasion and that kind of thing. And it gives Modani a new sense of gratitude, what that means to be alive in the morning. And so even in the relative safety of being in Jerusalem, it does give this sense of just profound vulnerability and the profound vulnerability of the existence of the state of Israel.
I'm a pacifist. I'm not happy that there's a war. I'm horrified that there's a war. I'm in pain that there's a war. I would like to raise my children to be diplomats and to find peaceful solutions. That's my goal. But I also need to know how to protect themselves. And I'm sad about that, deeply sad.
I feel bad. I wish after a year now I had something more joyous to say or more of a happy ending. But as Yehuda said in the podcast a year ago, we are still meto mutal lefanav. We really still are in a situation, the same situation of our dead being before us. Some people here are still counting, would call today day 354 of October. We're still in many, many ways in that darkness that spread over our world on the Shabbat HaShchora, on the Black Shabbat, as they call it here.
I've listened to some talks by other people who are incredibly pessimistic of the country. I'm not pessimistic. We're going to get over this. I don't know how. I don't know how long it's going to take. Eventually, Israel will rebuild. I think Gaza will rebuild. I think the Lebanon, when they calm down, they'll rebuild. Rav Kook beautifully says there's repentance for the individual and there's repentance for the nation. And I think that all the nations of the world, all the peoples of the world require repentance to get back on track of creating a better, peaceful world. And there has to be a way that people understand Israel's here forever. The Palestinians are not going away. We have to find some way to work out some sort of peaceful experience together. And fighting constantly the devastation is so colossal. There has to be a better way.
Our sons and our children are now going to have to fight these same wars and can go, and terrible things can happen. And that if you're a hostage, your country's not necessarily coming for you.
Do you know how bizarre it is for me to have a conversation with somebody who says to me, so where would you purchase property outside of Israel in case we need to leave Israel? Like, where would you go? Would you buy something in Greece? Would you buy something somewhere in Europe? And to me, as an American who made the life-altering decision to uproot our family 9 years ago and move here, this was our end game. This is our end game. It's so shocking having these kinds of conversations with people who are in the medical industry, in the tech industry, looking at our future and whether we will be able to thrive and flourish, or whether the decisions and the people who are put into power are going to lead us down a path that might not be recoverable. Saying those things opens up so many complicated thoughts and emotions for someone who was raised in the milieu I was raised in as a Zionist, modern Orthodox Jew.
I recognize all of those feelings, and yet despite it all, I really feel like this is where I want to be. And if I'm going to be working for a better future, this is the future I want to be working towards.
A colleague here that I supervise, sometime in October, November last year, said to me, I don't think Israel's going to exist in a year from now. All of the management classes that I've taken and leadership development, nothing prepares you for that moment where you're sitting in a session with your supervisee who says that your home that both of us have chosen as Olim, she fears it won't exist in a year from now. Well, here we are a year later, so that's something.
My very good friend is from Gaza. Another friend is from Ramallah. And right now I'm not in conversation with them. Our last conversation was my friend asking me, can we still believe in peace, Liz? Elizabeth, do we still believe in peace? Like him asking me, like needing reassurance, maybe not. I don't know if that's what it was. And I'm like, yes, I want to. Like if we can still believe in peace, then there still can be peace.
The flip side of fragility is that it feels like every moment is a miracle. And I'm not sure if I mean that in a divine or a human sense, but I feel that very much. Like things could explode. I mean, we live in a tinderbox. And the fact that for the most part, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Druze are sharing public spaces together and standing online at the pharmacy or the mall. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but it feels like each and every moment of that is a testament to people doing good and making the choices to like keep this fragile place alive and functioning. It feels like it's hundreds of thousands of daily decisions of normal people going about their lives who are in deep trauma, who are nonetheless, kind to each other for the most part when they're on the bus. And that feels like a big deal.
So what's changed? I don't know. I'm a lot less healthy. I'm a lot less healthy. My mental health is a lot less healthy. I only want to eat carbs. I'm less healthy. That's changed. I feel like I am both tougher and weaker at the same time. Yeah, it's been a really long year.
And it's going to be a really long year ahead. And I desperately hope that we will not have to bring these folks back again then, a year from now, to reflect on all the traumas that may have emerged since this recording. You'll hear this episode after Rosh Hashanah, which our tradition calls Memorial Day. You might be hearing it on the day of many communal commemorations of that Black Shabbat of October 7th a year ago. Now, looking forward, may we be blessed with the power of getting memory right, that the recounting of these events uplift us to create a world, and in it a state of Israel, in which such catastrophes can never happen again. Thank you to Diana Ginsburg, Avidan Friedman, Todd Berman, Dina Rabhan, Anna Bronstein, and Elizabeth Maiman for their messages. And thank you all for listening. This episode of Identity Crisis was produced by M. Lewis Gordon and our executive producer, Maytal Friedman, with assistance from Serena Shohead, who was mixed by Gareth Hobbs at Silver Sound NYC. Our music for this episode is provided by Blue Dot Sessions. We're always looking for ideas of what we should cover in future episodes. If you have a topic you'd like to hear about, or if you have comments about this one, please write to us at identitycrisis@shalomhartman.org. For more ideas from the Shalom Hartman Institute about what's unfolding right now, sign up for our newsletter in the show notes, and you can subscribe to this podcast everywhere podcasts are available. We have a special series coming your way in a few weeks about rabbis in America. We'll see you again starting then. Thank you for listening.